I'm Gerry Georgatos. Welcome to Opinionated. Each week I've been opening up with the mantra, the premise, that the ability to discover the truth is outstripped by the capacity to manifest deceit. It may not be more relevant than today. Today our topic is terrorism, the portrayal of terrorism. We'll be listening to a couple of guests, experts in our first segment. Dr. Anne Aly, a research fellow, associate professor at Curtin University and a policy advisor to both state and federal governments on terrorism and counter-terrorism. And our second guest, crossover, will be Robert Barwick from the Citizen Electoral Council, a senior researcher who will also demonstrate expertise on this topic. But before we move on, let's thank our supporters who have made this possible: Stage and Studio Productions, Gateway Printing, William Jeffries Carpet, Warehouse Osborne Park, and Perth Prop and Party Shop. Now that that's done and dusted, let's go to our opening clip, which will frame the discussion that we'll head with in our next segment on radicalisation.
He says there were no outward signs that Yusra was radicalised, and they're convinced the internet was solely responsible. But how unusual is that? I spoke to Hannah Stewart, who's an expert in this field.
What we've seen over the last 15 years is an increase in online radicalisation, much in the same way as for the rest of us. The internet and social media has become more pervasive in our everyday life. So where people perhaps used to meet individuals in bookstores or in mosques or in community centres, we have an image of hate preachers. This is now just transferred online.
What do you think they could have said to her? This was a girl who's doing very well at school. She wanted to be a dentist. But now she's joined a group that doesn't believe in education for girls, that believes in horrific violence. What could they have said to have turned her?
I think it's very hard for most of us to understand this, but we have to think that the ties that we have to our community, to our family, to our country, how strong those are. What these groups manage to do is make young people believe that their ties to their religion, to their co-religionists, people who are being oppressed in Syria and Iraq, they try to twist that, to use that as leverage and then present themselves as the saviours of that religion, and that those young people need to go out and support them in order to advance their religion. Even
though she's only a 15-year-old girl?
Yes, well, the use of women by jihadist groups isn't that unusual. Usually they're a kind of supportive role, encouraging it's as mothers or as wives. But now what we're seeing with Islamic State is a real intent to shock us in the West. We've seen it with the brutality of the beheading videos, and now they're taking young girls. They're inverting that stereotype on us and scaring us. It's very similar to the use of suicide bombings. It's when they use as little as possible to strike as much fear into our hearts as possible.
Briefly, Hannah, if she's there tonight and she's feeling frightened and she wants to come home, how hard would it be to get out of that situation?
If she's worried about being criminalised on her return to the UK, I think she should come back. I think the government are very aware that there's a scale of individuals. There are some that pose a very serious threat.
But would they let her go?
The group ISIS, I'm not sure. I think it would be, now that they have her, I think it would be hard for them to let her go. Girls like Yusra are very strong marketing value for groups like Islamic State. I don't think they'd let her go voluntarily.
Hannah Stewart, thank you very much.
Welcome back to Opinionated. We'll start the show today, first segment, with Dr. Anne Aly, the eminent Dr. Anne Aly, who's an expert on terrorism, counter-terrorism, the portrayal of terrorism. And Anne, radicalisation, we're not going to be able to delve into this huge, vast topic, but let's talk about radicalisation and what it actually means. You've had a lot to say.
Yeah, I have had a lot to say, actually. You know, the thing with radicalisation is that it's based on a lot of assumptions, a lot of myths, a lot of hypotheses, but no real actual evidence. And so a lot of the stuff that we're operating on, the policies that are made, the programs that are developed on the basis of myth and hypothesis. You know, there's no simple answer to why some young people become attracted to a cause or an ideology to the point that they want to commit an act of violence in support of that cause or that ideology. But I like to think of it more like a combination lock. You know, radicalisation doesn't occur in a vacuum. Someone doesn't wake up one morning and go, hey, you know what, I'm going to be radicalised and go out there and commit crimes against humanity. So it's very much like a combination lock where you have three different elements to it. You've got the environment, you've got the social factors, and then you've got the individual factors. And within each of those elements, or within each of those factors, you've got a number of different things that make up that factor. So in environment, you've got global trends, you've got global issues like the current conflict in Iraq and Syria. In the social element, you've got the social circumstances and the social conditions in which an individual is operating and in which radicalisation and radicalising influences emerge. And then you've got the individual factors, individual psychology, personal trajectories, personal histories. Now, you put all of those three together, and then you look at all the factors that come under that and think of a combination lock. Think of all the different combinations that you can have with those three factors and the myriad of elements that come under those factors. And you've actually got an extremely complex phenomenon. But
can we actually, you've talked about a lot of risk factors inherently in that. What about protective factors? Are there any way protective factors that we can strengthen to reduce radicalisation?
There are certainly protective factors. And I often say, you know, if you walk into a room of 6-year-olds and you say to them, what do you want to be when you grow up? What are they going to tell you? Most 6-year-olds will say things like, I want to be a policeman, I want to be a nurse, I want to be a truck driver, I want to be this. No 6-year-old stands up and says, I want to be a terrorist and kill people. So we're actually born with something called, or we're conditioned to, we're socialised to know what's right and wrong. And this is called moral engagement. And there's a point there where the kinds of narratives, the kinds of stories that violent extremist organisations come up with and sell in order to attract people use a mechanism called moral disengagement.
But have we actually eroded the protective factors within society, that we've made people vulnerable to this fear-mongering of others that can actually radicalise people?
I do believe so. I believe that there are social conditions that do very much erode those protective factors. One of the protective factors that we found is critical thinking skills, developing critical thinking skills in young people, reinforcing their moral engagement through telling of moral stories, through education of moral type education. But when we've got a society which reinforces boundaries of us and them, these are the very conditions that allow violent extremism and radicalisation to thrive.
Your PhD explored the mediated fear that's manifest between Muslim communities and the broader community.
Yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit about that? Because you're talking about potentially veils and layers of racism?
Absolutely. One of the things that I looked at with my PhD, first of all, was what people thought a terrorist was, and then where they got those opinions from, and then what they feared about a terrorist attack. And what I found was I interviewed 180 people, so it was a huge study. Yeah, it was really, really big. But what I found was that among the Muslims that I interviewed, their fear of a terrorist attack wasn't just grounded in the actual fear of physical harm of a potential attack, but the physical harm of the backlash to a terrorist attack, the response to a terrorist attack, the alienation of that a response to a terrorist attack would occur. And their levels of fear were actually much higher than the levels of fear of the broader community and much more grounded in personal experiences of racism.
If I may ask, because my own PhD research was in racism, unveiling the various layers, are we actually dividing, fracturing society, and are we creating underclasses?
I believe that Australia, over the last decade or 2 decades or so, has certainly moved that way. You know, this is not this. I remember growing up in Australia and playing street cricket with the kids in the street. You know, where you had the garbage bin as the wickets. Nobody ever asked what your religion was. Nobody ever cared what your religion was. I think the Australia that we live in today is very much fractured along different lines, along lines of race, along lines of ethnicity, and certainly much more than it was in the past.
Is that a global thematic, or is that isolated to Australia?
I don't think it's isolated to Australia. I think that it is global, but I don't think we have strong leadership here in Australia to address that.
Thank you, Anne. We'll move on to our crossover guest, Robert Barwick. I've introduced you from the Citizens Electoral Council, a researcher. You've been on the program before. What's your view on what's actually happening in the country and around the globe?
Well, I look at it from the standpoint not of the personal motivation of the people that might get involved in terrorism, but the strategic agenda that sweeps them up, that uses them. So, because what we've witnessed, especially since 9/11 in the Western world, is terrorism has become very useful to the powers that be to be able to be the excuse for them to grab for themselves extraordinary far-reaching powers that strip us of our civil liberties, that the Australian country, people in a country like Australia think, when they hear about these laws that get passed, oh yeah, that's for rounding up radical Muslims, but the actual legislation never says Muslim. It can apply to anybody. These are laws that encroach on our civil liberties that are so extraordinary, but the government needs a terrorist threat to justify them, and also wars. We're in a global era of almost permanent war ever since 9/11, and the same people that should...
If I put it to you, Robert, is that not the human narrative? Has that not always been the narrative that we've crafted wars and there's a dichotomy of the oppressor and the oppressed? Or are you saying that it's much more intensified now?
Well, no, it's definitely intensified since 9/11. Of course, there is a more general version of that throughout history, but it's a repetition of a modus operandi that's always been wielded by imperial powers, if you can put it that way, right? They in order to justify heavy-handed imperialism, they have to create for their own populations this enemy image, right? And they call it something like terrorism. And they're very liberal in throwing that term around. So in the last 12 months, for instance, the people in eastern Ukraine who are Russian-speaking, who resist the Nazi coup that toppled their government, they're called terrorists by the new Western-backed government in Kiev, right? And all they are is people protecting their own homeland, but they're supposedly terrorists. There's a lot more that has to be exposed about how transparent this agenda is. Gerry, for instance, one of the campaigns we're on globally is to have the 28 pages of the US Congress's 9/11 report that are classified made public. It's a big report. Only 28 pages are made public because those 28 pages relate to the role of the Saudi royal family in funding the 9/11 hijackers. But while America subsequently declared war on Afghanistan and Iraq, Saudi Arabia not only got off scot-free, but they've been able to go on and fund these elements like ISIS.
On that note, Robert, you're actually describing something overwhelming. Do we actually have the capacity to overwhelm that? Do we actually have the capacity to bring people to account and then to an outcomes-based approach?
Oh, I think we do. It's a political question. There's some interesting political campaigns in the US and the UK at the moment that the establishment in both countries find hard to put back in the box, like the Jeremy Corbyn campaign for the UK Labor Party leadership and the Bernie Sanders campaign for the Democratic Party presidential nomination in the United States. They're getting very broad popular support from the kind of citizens who are who've had enough of this war agenda. They're saying enough is enough, and they're throwing their weight and their enthusiasm behind candidates who can actually make a difference. It's not, the world doesn't always have to be this way. You can make a difference, but the truth is what's most important, and people have to see through these transparent agendas. So, just take what's happening in Australia right now. It's good that we're accepting 12,000 refugees, but at the same time we're announced we're going to be bombing Syria. And it's all done in the name of, ISIS is the enemy image at the moment, yet the United States Defense Intelligence Agency back in 2012 reported to the White House that their policy was what was creating ISIS, but they said that that's useful because our largest strategy is to topple Assad, and ISIS will be useful to be a bulwark against Assad. So we're supposedly, we're putting our troops in harm's way, and the West is putting their own troops in harm's way against an enemy that our side created in the first place.
Robert,
and while
Robert, look,
yes,
thank you on that mix of dire circumstance and hope that you've expressed. We've got to wrap up just there and go to a quick commercial break and be back.